Gary Perkins is going to talk to you about practical advice on how to secure your home devices and networks. Gary is our Chief Information Security Officer for the Government of British Columbia. As Executive Director of the Information Security Branch, he's responsible for providing cybersecurity services in support of the province. So please, everybody welcome Gary and his presentation, Tips for Securing Your Devices at Home. Thanks for joining us, Gary.
Thank you very much, Jackie, and fantastic job today. Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the final session of Security Day. I can't think of a more timely and relevant security topic than cyber hygiene during a time of working from home, and you've heard from some really awesome speakers today. My promise is that by the end of this presentation, everyone will have learned something. If you stay until the very end and haven't learned anything, you should be on jeopardy. If you don't learn something about securing your devices, don't worry. I have a backup plan at the end. So last Security Day, I introduced the ABCs of security. I commented on how great it was that security falls so nicely into the ABCs. So if you remember, A stands for awareness, like the event that we're doing today with Security Day. B stands for the backups of your critical data. And then C naturally stands for patching. You can see how that works, right? So today we're going to continue with some tips on how to protect your devices and applications at home. I recommend always starting out with knowing what you have to lose, right? Is it your banking information? Is it your family photos? Or is it your research for your graduate degree? And take precautions accordingly. We've always heard that you should use your own firewall and anti-malware. You may not want to depend on the ones that are provided by your service provider. You may want to take some additional precautions and install one yourself. This is a key one. You've heard maybe some of the themes that have emerged here this Security Day. Install updates for your operating system and applications. When it prompts you to install those updates, don't hit postpone, hit yes, install them, and better yet, turn them on automatically if you can. They're almost always a good thing. Make sure to back up your important data. We heard a bit more about that, and make sure to disconnect that device so that it's not impacted by ransomware. I've got separate slides on backing up and how to do that because we get those questions. People want to know, you keep talking about this, but how do I do it? We heard a little bit about password managers in the past. We recommend using a password manager. I personally not a huge fan of cloud-based ones, but that's up to you. Don't click on those suspicious links and attachments that you get in the email. Again, they're more targeted than ever and can be tug on the heartstrings like Justin just talked about. Use strong passwords and don't share them. Better yet, use multi-factor or what we call two-factor authentication. I've got a separate slide here on passwords. And make sure to demonstrate and lead by example and using these good cyber hygiene practices both at work and at home, right? So moving on to passwords. Who has heard this advice? You know, put up your hand. I won't be able to see if you do or you don't. Who has heard this advice? First, use strong passwords. Don't share them with anyone. Include uppercase, lowercase, punctuation, a haiku, symbols, extended ASCII. Make sure they're 87 characters long. Don't use the same one twice. Don't write it down. Change them every day. No. There's some good advice in here and there's some bad advice in here, and it's just really unrealistic. And what you should take away from the presentations here today is that the only time you should be using passwords is when you don't have a better alternative like multi-factor authentication. For those of you who are still wondering what that is, it may be where you run across this as either when you're connecting into your work environment or increasingly now banks, because they recognize that your financial information and personal data is at risk, and so they want to protect that, and then they offer you applications or other ways of ensuring you have a second factor for logging in, so it's not just based on a password. Now, we go to backups. I wanted to make sure to provide some practical tips. So I find that a lot of folks overcomplicate backups. Got it, that this isn't the perfect way of doing it, but this is one way. So the first one is you go and buy a storage device. You can go to the big box stores or order it online. And when I did this, when I put this information together, you could buy a 4 terabyte backup or hard drive, external hard drive for about $100. That should be enough to hold all of your information, probably and then some, unless you're a photographer, and then no amount of storage in the world is going to be enough to hold all of your photos. Connect the device to your computer, copy the relevant files over to it, Then this is a very important one, disconnect the device from your computer. And that one's critical. Again, remember, when your computer gets infected and that infection spreads, we want to make sure that your data is protected. The best way to do that is have that hard drive disconnected, then repeat it on some kind of a schedule. And this one trips people up as well. They want to know, how often should I do it? Well, it's pretty easy. You just think about how much data are you prepared to lose. Like, so if you're willing to lose up to a month worth of data, then you should do your backups monthly. If that's not acceptable to you, then you should do them more often than that. Turning our eyes toward safe browsing. Obviously, when you're out there, the internet can be a dangerous place. You heard earlier from Scott Jones about surfing only to reputable sites and some tips on how to identify those. Make sure that you're looking, and one of the tips he provided was looking for the lock to know that you're browsing securely, and reputable sites typically will have a certificate that puts the lock and says that it's secure browsing. That doesn't necessarily mean that the site is reputable, but it's just one more sign that your connection between you and the website is encrypted. Here's one that I like that not everybody thinks about, is if you in your home have different people using computers for different reasons, and you find that you do your browsing, general internet browsing on one computer, maybe think about using a different computer for your banking, and just stick to the kind of legitimate and work-related tasks on that computer, and do the general browsing where people tend to get more infected on a different computer. Once upon a time, this wasn't very realistic because, again, computers were high price point of $3,000. You wouldn't want to have multiples of those, but nowadays you can get computers, starting at the entry level for $5 for a Raspberry Pi Zero. So this is one option that people might decide to pursue. Always, when you're surfing around the internet, consider a pop-up or ad blocker, so that it's not the legitimate ads necessarily that you're trying to block that are helping subsidize and put that website, keep it in business, but it's the malware that you can pick up this way. And the last one is, one thing to consider is in your browser settings. There's lots of great privacy and security preserving settings in your browser. One of them is to turn off scripts. And we're going to examine a couple more browser settings on the next slide here. But be aware that the privacy and security settings are in there, and review them from time to time. I got a couple of slides on this. One of them I bet you a bunch of people are not aware of. So in the browser settings here, here's one that I'm going to give you. Now, obviously, I can't put up every browser out there. So in this particular case, the screenshots are from Google Chrome. Most browsers have similar types of functions. The ones that I would highlight in this particular case is there's an option there for safe browsing. It's probably not going to hurt anything. I don't think it's going to be the be-all end-all and protect you from everything, but you might as well enable it. The second one, I'm going to bounce around over to the right-hand side here where it says send a do not track. Again, can't testify to the effectiveness of it, but enabling it, probably not a bad thing either. The one in the bottom right, I'm going to focus on the clear browsing data. Do that from time to time. Note that if you do clear your cookies, that's probably going to log you out of all of the sites that you're logged into and be a little bit inconvenient when you have to log back in, but probably a good practice to do from time to time. You can also clear the data, the cache, without clearing the cookies at that time, and you can do that more often. In fact, it'll probably increase the performance of your computer. The one that I really want you to look at and consider, and everybody who attends this should go and look for this setting, is around blocking third-party cookies. That's a critical setting. In this case, it's turned off. You want to click that over to the on position, and then instantly you're probably going to find that the ads that you get when you travel around the internet are a little less creepy because they're not quite as targeted. So they're not going to be based on you just went to Home Depot and were searching for a ladder, and then you get a barrage of ladder ads on Facebook. You might see an improvement in that if you look at this setting. So that's one takeaway from this already. But I do urge you to go in and check the settings from time to time, and I'm going to drill that home on the next slide here. So I say go in to both your browser, but also go into your social media and look at the settings there, because they are increasingly adding different settings. Some of them are enabled by default, and you may not be aware because you weren't told that they are there. And so if you don't go look, you don't know. One I'm going to point out was making the rounds on social media, and I think it's a big eye opener for people who use things like Facebook. I'm going to use an example here. So if on Facebook you go up to the top right corner and pull down the kind of the settings or the down arrow, and then you go over to your, I think it's your, I want to say it's settings. It'll look a little bit like this, and you want to look for the setting that talks about your off Facebook activity here. So it says viewer clear activity from businesses, etc. Bring that up and then go and follow the steps to get to your off Facebook activity. Now in this case, it's cleared. I didn't want to show you all the different places that I or wherever this was grabbed from had been recently, but I'm going to bet for the average person who has a Facebook account that goes in there and looks at this and it's not already turned off, I think you're going to be shocked. Look at all the information that's being tracked on you and consider whether that's appropriate and whether you want to clear that and disable it. It's up to you. Go check it out. Next one, we saw a couple of phishing examples across the presentations today. So I just wanted to break it down one more time for the people wondering, what should I look for? I took a random example of a phishing email that I was sent just to make it real. And some of the things that you want to look for. Obviously, these messages have an intent in mind that is not legitimate. So, and they're going to create a sense of urgency and play on your emotions to get you to click on it or do what they want. So some of the things we tell you to do, one of them is look at the from address. Are you expecting, do you recognize that domain? Do you recognize a sender? Is this somebody that you've done business or have communications with? And if you don't recognize them, you should probably ignore the email. The second one is, who was it sent to? Was it sent to your legitimate email address, or was that hidden in some way? Is there anything suspicious about the address it was sent to? Was it sent to you if your name is John Smith and it's sent to John Smith 123 and 50 other John Smith? Third one is looking, in this case, the email has an attachment. You can look at the file name as well and know that that looks a little generic, possibly suspicious. Then some other things like, what is the content of the email? What is it telling you to do? If it just says hi, it's probably not going to be super malicious. But if it's got a link or attachment in there or asking you to respond or confirm that this email address works, then that's when you're going to be more suspicious. And then the other sign is when it's asking you, or it's telling you that there's a password for the attached document. Normally at this point, I would ask folks, why do you think that there's a password included here? And the most common reason is because by password off the document, it prevents a lot of antivirus or anti-malware systems from detecting it as suspicious or malicious, right? So that's another sign. It's not to make you feel super secret when only you can open this document. Next thing to look at is, who is it signed off at? Here they have a bit of an identity problem because it looks like as if it's signed off with two different signatures. So lots of indicators on these emails, but not every email you get is going to be this obvious. Some of them are, again, getting a lot more targeted where they've done their research and they've you can no longer count on spelling mistakes and grammar to determine whether it's a malicious email. And this can happen to anybody. If you're not paying attention, you haven't had your coffee yet in the morning, it's really easy to click on one of these things. And if you have clicked on it, I recommend telling somebody. Tell somebody that can help you assess the damage. Usually it's your local IT if you're at work. Okay, going on to Wi-Fi. Many thanks to some of the speakers before me, such as Dale Land, that covered a lot of this stuff so that I don't have to. I would, for those of you that a lot of this is review for, recommend using this as a bit of a checklist. Say, have I done these things recently? Like, for example, when you get your new router, your Wi-Fi router out of the box, it's going to have a generic username and password. Best practices are to change those, at least the password, if not the username. Often there'll be more than one account. You could have a guest account that needs to be disabled, and it'll have an SSID. Most people just know this as like their Wi-Fi hotspot name. Some people get really creative, some people not. You've seen out there in the public ones called things like FBI Surveillance Van 3917, and some more creative ones out there. Recommend changing these, but make sure that when you do so, that you're not leaking additional information. Like if you change the username from admin to something and your name is John Smith, I'm not sure I'd change it to J Smith. The other thing is, with your SSID, when you set your Wi-Fi hotspot name for your house, I'm not sure that I would call it John Smith's house on Harrow Street or Robson Street or something like that. Anything that's going to give people information. Although I guess you could make it up. It could be completely bogus to throw people off. I talked about disabling the guest and generic accounts. Dale earlier mentioned the need to use encryption. Modern standard is WPA2. If you're not using encryption or your encryption is set to WEP right now, run away. That's not sufficient nowadays to prevent people from eavesdropping on your conversations. Another thing that not everybody does out there, but is an option you can consider, it's a little bit of a hassle if you have guests coming into your house and they always want to know what your Wi-Fi name and password are. And then you have to decide whether you want to allow these people onto your network. But you can disable the broadcast of your SSID. It's not going to stop a determined attacker, but that's an option in most Wi-Fi routers these days, so that when somebody opens up their phone, it doesn't advertise the fact that it's there. Another one that to consider is having multiple Wi-Fi networks. And so if I don't mention this later with Internet of Things, that's the best use of this that I can think of. So you'd have one Wi-Fi network. A lot of the routers, this isn't anything too fancy. A lot of routers will support this nowadays, including the ones provided to you by Shaw and Telus, to have multiple Wi-Fi networks. So you can have one for your trusted devices that you're using for your personal browsing and banking, things like that. And then you can have another one for all the stuff that you bought online that might not preserve your privacy and security in a way that you're comfortable with. And that could be your Internet of Things level devices like your Nest thermostat and others. And I find this one's kind of funny because usually when prompted within your Wi-Fi router settings, and I would urge you tonight to take some time to make sure that you even know how to log into it. And I've got a bit of an exercise on the next page here on how to do that. But when prompted with these settings, one of the settings in there is how strong do you want the signal to be? And that seems, pretty obvious to people. It should be super strong as it can be. Like if it'll go higher than 10, why wouldn't I? But I'm not convinced that you need to be able to connect to your own personal home Wi-Fi from your supermarket that's a mile away, right? There is some security to be had for just limiting it to maybe the boundaries of your property or the boundaries of your house, so that not everybody has to have access to your, or at least see your Wi-Fi SSID pop up in their list. We talked, there's mention earlier about using VPNs, especially on public Wi-Fi. Never conduct anything that's sensitive if you are on a public Wi-Fi that has no password or has the same password for everybody, or you don't know how the privacy and security of that connection is being maintained. Then I'd ask you that when you are connected in some of these places, whether it's a library, whether it's a rec center, and you're connected to a Wi-Fi access point like Starbucks, how do you even know that that's really the one you're connected to? How do you know that's the legitimate one? It could be an imposter. So here is an example that I recommend that you do tonight. It's how to log into your Wi-Fi router or your router for your internet connection. And it's this last step that I really want you to pay attention to. But for those who are unsure on how to do this, the first thing you want to do is check the IP address on your computer. And in that IP address setting, it's going to tell you what your default gateway is. Usually that is your IP address of your router. So it's very often 192.168.1.1, or it could be .1.254 and some other variations. You put that IP address into the URL of your browser, and then it's going to prompt you with a page like you see on the left here. You're going to log into that with the username and password if known. If you don't have the password, then you're going to have to take some other steps probably to restore that. When you do go in there, familiarize yourself with some of the different settings. Look at what your SSID number is. But the one that I really want you to do is look at all the devices that are connected and play a game that says, can you identify every one of them? Unless you are a Luddite or have severely restricted the number of devices that connect, you're going to have trouble doing this, because you're going to see everything from the Nintendo Switch to the Alexa digital assistant and the Rokus and all of these different things. And it can be challenging, but a worthwhile exercise to make sure that only you are using your Wi-Fi, right? So there's an exercise to try this evening. With respect to your phones, how many people, when you see your phone, you get prompted with a notice like this that says the new version of iOS is available for your iPhone and ready to install? The reason I started putting this in my slides is because somebody said, you always talk about patching your devices. How do I do that? And I said, well, it's easy. You know that really annoying message that pops up and asks you if you want to install the update and you always say later? Don't say later. Say install now. In fact, go beyond that and turn it on to install updates automatically. So in addition to that, some of the other things we recommend, make sure you have a PIN for your phone and that you haven't shared it with all your BFFs and your family and your girlfriend or boyfriend. It should be something that just you know, otherwise you can't be sure where that information is going to end up. When you get that opportunity, not just for the operating system itself, but some of your favorite apps like Angry Birds, make sure to update those or turn on auto updates. Avoid rooting or jailbreaking your phone. If you don't know what that means, that's probably a good thing. And try to make sure that when you do install apps that they came from the legitimate Play Store. If you are told that in order to install the app, you need to go into your settings and turn on and enable installing apps from unknown sources, that should be the first clue that something you're doing probably isn't legitimate. It may be, there are some cases where you need to do this, but it's another sign that it's something suspicious, right? You can consider whether an anti-malware program is going to be useful on your device. Think about it. These are not phones anymore. They are computers with phone apps. So in some cases, the anti-malware program is going to be more useful on some platforms than others. And I would have to just put the disclaimer here that says when you're using a company-owned device, make sure to listen to them and inquire on what the appropriate steps are before creating your own or listening to my steps up here, because they may have different recommendations. So getting toward the end here with Internet of Things, I like to cover this because I like to point out that when you bring these things into your house, each one of them conferred some kind of benefit onto you. Maybe it's your health with your Fitbit, or managing your power consumption or expenses with your Nest thermostat. But you know, just because you can connect some of these things to the internet, I don't think you necessarily should. Like, I don't know who came up with the internet connected toilet, and in themselves, maybe there's some utility to these things, but my concerns really start happening when these devices start talking to one another. Like, I start to get pretty concerned when my toilet is telling my fridge that's keeping track of my shopping list for the grocery store that I need more fiber in my diet. That there may be some utility in that, but that's not the kind of creepiness that I'm looking forward to in my life. And then we've got to realize that these things also need to be protected. These are the devices that are least likely to have basic privacy and security controls built into them. So you really need to make sure that you know what you're getting into with these devices so you can protect them, put them behind your firewall within your house. You can put them on a separate network like I recommended. Make sure to patch these things or update them. That's a big concern in this area because a lot of these devices, they were designed to be single purpose and really, in a lot of cases, disposable, which I think is horrible for the keeping our planet green and not filling landfills with just garbage electronic devices after they've grown old or slow or something like that. So it's great when they can be patched and updated and hopefully improve their security in doing so. Make sure that when you do buy one of these devices, even from the big box stores, I'm telling you, I'm not one who reads a lot of manuals. I like to believe that I can figure it out otherwise, but I do recommend that you read the agreement that you just signed up to by using it. I think you'll find some surprises in there from time to time if you look at it very closely. Like one of the devices that you buy from a big box store, in the agreement, it talks about how by using the device, you've granted it the authority to go and scan the devices that are on your network. I never want to enable another device to do that. If I'm going to do that, I want it to be myself doing it. I don't want to trust that to a third-party Internet of Things level device. Beware the app. So when you get one of these home, you bought it from a perfectly reputable place, it looks like a reputable device, then you take it home and it says, step number 1, either scan this QR code, which I'm not a big fan of QR codes, or second, browse to the store and download and install this app. When you look at those apps, how many of them look seriously sketchy, right? And it's because a lot of them are. So beware of that. So the device itself may not be the problem, but the app that you install on your device will. And again, it's about being alert, paying attention, and seeing things that just don't look right. And including some of the permissions that it asks you to do. So if you've got the internet connected toilet, it probably shouldn't be requesting the permission to take videos or pictures and things, right? Ew, what a gross thought that is. And then think about some of the benefits and implications. Like I tell you that this has changed our life. A lot of these things bring benefits into our homes and allow us to work and collaborate with others more seamlessly. But think about the downsides as well. Same with your Wi-Fi router. If there are guest or default passwords or accounts, you want to get rid of those. And what I just really want to highlight is with some of these things like the nanny cams and such, this internet connected teddy bear, what kind of parent buys a teddy bear that looks as creepy as this one does and brings it into their home? Look at it. The thing looks evil. Well, I didn't know the answer to this question, but now I do. I know what type of parent buys a teddy bear that looks like this and brings it into their home. It's the same parent that on their home, like baby cams, has kids that look like this. I'm still having nightmares after seeing these pictures. If I ever look down at my baby monitor, which had video, and I saw a kid looking back at me like this, I would run out of my house screaming. So now I think I've figured out who buys those creepy looking teddy bears to surveil their children because they already look a little bit creepy. So in summary, I am going to read a bit off the slides because some of these are really important notes, and we're not done here because I got to fulfill my promise and make sure that you learn something here today. But the attacks, as we've heard out there, they're increasing in frequency. They're quite targeted. Everybody needs to make sure to take steps to protect themselves and their devices and apps and at home. But make sure that the steps that you're taking are proportionate with what you have to lose. It's rare that somebody doesn't have anything to lose. And even in those cases, if you allowed your devices to be compromised, those devices could be used to compromise somebody else, and you don't want that to happen. So even if you didn't have anything to lose, your devices could be used in compromising somebody else. And I don't think you want to be responsible for that. Realize that it may sound at times, you heard a lot of acronyms today, it may sound like you need to have a PhD to solve a lot of these problems, but realize you just do the cyber hygiene, the things that are the equivalent of washing your hands and brushing your teeth. You do that, do the basics consistently, and you can stop 80% of the problems, hopefully more than that. But really focus on getting the basics and doing them consistently, and just watch out, stay alert. You got to be very mindful when you're navigating the internet these days. Watch for anything out of the ordinary and make sure to think before you click. Of course, remember that security is everyone's responsibility. You're not alone. Don reminds me that I'm not alone all the time. There is actually strength in numbers. So what I mean from this is everybody that's listening here today has family and friends that they can share this information with. If you're unsure about something, you can ask somebody else, and maybe they have the answer, or maybe the two of you can then go and ask an expert. But at this point, I want to make sure to fulfill my promise. And I said that you would be learning something you didn't know. So if you haven't learned something about computers, devices, applications yet, then I'm going to give you some things to make sure that I fulfill my promise. And so some of them are really unrelated to security, but I'll pull any cheap trick to make sure that I fulfill my promise. And so I would ask you, did you know that penguins can swim 15 miles an hour, dive to 800 feet, grow to 5 feet tall, and a group of penguins is called a raft? If you knew all of those things and you are a Jeopardy contestant, well, then I would hit you with the rest of these facts. Things like a snail can have 25,000 teeth, and the Jetpan is facing a Ninja shortage. And again, if you know all of these things, you should be on jeopardy. But just remember that just because it's written on the internet doesn't make it true. Some of the facts that I found up there, like there's experts debating on whether a donkey or a mule will sink in quicksand. So you need to fact check some of these things. And I'd say that that's all I have today. I do want to thank everybody for coming and invite you to join me in wishing the astronauts of SpaceX a safe journey, as they're scheduled to take off at 1:30, I understand. If it hasn't been canceled, then you can watch this online if you Google NASA and SpaceX. Do we have any time for questions?
Actually, I think there was a decision made that yes, we are going to have questions. It's too valuable for presentations lose. So take it away, Ken.
Excellent. Well, I see those questions up here, so I'll try to address some of them. One of the people asked whether a personal router is needed, or is the one that's provided by your service provider like TELUS or Shaw sufficient? And that is a personal decision that's up to you. If you have very little to lose, then perhaps that's going to be sufficient. But if you want to get more control over what data is shared where, then you can add your own in there. I know a lot of the folks in the security field, speak highly of their own internal controls, but some of those people may be just a little bit paranoid at some times. Another question in here is, do I practice what I preach? Do you follow all of the suggestions you're providing here today? What a fantastic question. I would say that I try to model and lead by example in the vast majority of these. I'm trying to think of one example that I don't use there. I would say that for just pulling a random one, when we talk about Wi-Fi routers, because there's a question about disabling SSID broadcast there, I would say that I disable broadcast on some of my networks, and then I enable broadcast on others. So that would be an example of totally dodging your question. In the question of, is disabling SSID broadcast secure? I don't see any reason why not. All we're really doing is saying that we're not going to tell everybody what our SSID for our Wi-Fi router is, and instead, to know it, you typically would have to ask the person or be told, but that's not totally correct. If you're determined enough, you can, and have the right devices and access, you can get that Wi-Fi router. So I wouldn't say there's anything unsecure about disabling SSID broadcast. A couple other questions in here. One is around, should you encrypt your backup device? That's again up to you. It's a personal decision based on the sensitivity of that data. I would say if and this is the case for most families, is that the most precious thing they have is their family photos. If that's all that's on the drive, and you're not concerned about those falling into the public domain, if that hard drive, for example, was stolen or lost or that kind of thing, you wouldn't need to encrypt it. But if you're going to put your tax information or financial data or anything else that's more sensitive, then yes, I would recommend encrypting it. And you've got a bunch of options out there for that. And last question that I see in here, I love this question too. I hadn't seen it previously. This speaks to something that I do personally. So they ask, is one external backup sufficient, or do you recommend a second in case? Oh, what do I recommend here? I recommend a whole lot of things. I don't want to be in a position where I lose my data. So I'm going to tell you what I do. I have multiple backups of all the data on site. Some of them are connected, some of them are not connected. And then I have additional copies that are off-site in a secure location. Now, the problem with all of this is maintaining currency of this information. So if you've got something that's remote and it's not connected all the time because you don't want to lose it, then how do you keep it out of date? So anybody who's figured this out realizes that that information then again is only going to be as current as the frequency that you back it up or update it. So if you only do that once a year, then you could lose up to a year of data. But I do recommend having multiple copies, and it's completely up to you if you feel comfortable doing things like having this information, say, encrypted and backed up in the cloud. Again, not something that I'm super enthused about, and that's why I go with the approach that I have. But again, it's harder to maintain. So again, thank you very much for those questions there. And I understand that we're getting to the end here and have some requests.